Catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.
Hello, I'm Tony. Join me as I dissect the latest trends in the world of tech, from business, agriculture, education, governance, and emerging tech. Make it a date with Tony's Tech Side. Let's talk tech.
Hi, Joel. Good to meet you.
Hi.
So,
thanks so much for having me. Good to meet you too.
Great.
Yeah, happy to introduce myself. So I'm Joel. I've been in the e-commerce space, I guess about, I don't even know, 13 or 14 years. Even before that, going back to when I was in high school, I started selling things on eBay back in the day, back in the early days of the internet. But it's funny enough, I got my start in tech. I'm originally from the States, but I was living in Cape Town and struggling to find work, and started a few online stores selling Apple products, Apple accessories, cables and stuff. And then through that, I ended up, long story short, getting a job at WooCommerce. And so I spent about 7 years working for e-commerce platforms. And a lot of that time I was based in South Africa. I later moved to London for a few years, where I went to work for Shopify for a while. And that's where I met Shola, the CEO of Paystack, because we were doing a bit of a partnership between Shopify and Paystack. When Paystack first got out of Y Combinator, they were trying to get onto Shopify. I worked at Shopify and I said, let's do something. And he was so great to work with. And I enjoyed him so much that when I moved back to South Africa, I reached out and then ultimately started working at Paystack in 2019. So yeah, I've had a few different kind of roles at Paystack, but the thing I've been the most busy with the last few years is getting South Africa off the ground. And it's been very fun to do something where you go from nothing to something. I mean, I guess not nothing. Paystack was already doing well in Nigeria, but in South Africa, we're not, Paystack wasn't that well known. And so it's been very fun to be part of something from 0 to 1 and then trying to figure out how to grow it from there.
thanks for the backstory. Now, if you look back at those years, how would you describe the growth of the fintech and e-commerce sector from way back then, even before Paystack, to like right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of ways to answer that. I think maybe the simplest way to answer it is, when I started at Woo in South Africa and then at Shopify in Europe and looking more globally, I think at that time, it's almost become normal or like the standard, especially in Western countries, for any retailer to also have an online presence, right? I think we are seeing that way more in African markets now. I think especially COVID I know a lot of people have talked about it, but pushed things way forward, where even like restaurants and places that maybe didn't even think about e-commerce are now had to think about, how do I collect money? How do I interact with people that aren't right in front of me? How do I keep my business afloat during that tough time? But it's come such a long way. I mean, I remember when I started at Woo in South Africa, there was, maybe in the low thousands of online stores in South Africa. Most of them were bigger retailers. Many of them, as payment methods, just had an option where they would put their bank account, and you had to on the checkout, you would have to send them an email with your proof of payment from your bank account, right? And so it's been pretty wild. I know, at that time I wasn't as in touch with what was happening in West Africa or Nigeria, but I'm sure it's not that different, right? It's come such a long ways. I mean, it's so much easier to get started with payments. As an individual, you can get started with payments. There's tools now that are free. It used to be considered something you would need to have built. It's now, there's free tools, or you can sell on Instagram, you can sell on WhatsApp, if you're just getting started. So I think the connectivity to each other has also just helped so much, but it's just so much easier. And so everyone, a lot of businesses are now doing it. I guess the question is now, how do people get good at it? Or what are the next steps? How do you build the best platform? Because with it being easier means it's also increasingly competitive, and you have marketplaces and you have other people that have come onto the scene. So yeah, it's a very broad answer, but things have come a really long way, highlighting accessibility, the rise of marketplaces, and the lower a barrier of entry for people to actually get started.
And the relationship between, like payment platforms and e-commerce platforms, how in sync is it at this point in time?
Yeah, I think what we see with e-commerce platforms, so, the two most popular ones in Africa and most of the world being Shopify and WooCommerce, you see that they actually have, in the past, I don't know, even 7 years, invested a lot in their payment stack. So, our parent company Stripe powers a lot of that, where they make it so that these platforms can actually create their own payment product. So you have like Shopify payments and WooCommerce payments. Makes it really simple for people to get started, and the checkout experience is really good. And it's also helped those platforms monetize payments, so Shopify makes more money on financial services than selling their software. In Africa, we're how can I put it gently? I feel like, unfortunately, a lot of these platforms that have done innovation haven't brought all of that to Africa. And I think at Paystack, we're pushing that envelope, just super easy to get started in minutes. We put a lot of effort into our checkout experience being frictionless and making it work well with e-commerce platforms. So, for example, in Nigeria, we're the only payment platform that makes it so you can process your refunds from WooCommerce, right? So I think it's taking that extra step to think about how can we work with these platforms to make it better. Long term, we would love to build a product with WooCommerce or Shopify or these platforms, but there's some limitations there. I think the other thing I could say is, at Paystack, we've rolled out our own storefronts product, right? So I think for sellers that aren't ready to spend money on Shopify or build a WooCommerce site or WordPress site or Wix site, we have a tool where they can just go in, they can set up a free Paystack account and actually build a pretty robust online store with a subdomain that we provide. If they're just getting started, right? So for free, you can just get your feet wet with e-commerce from payment providers. And I think some of that just comes from trying to meet businesses where they're at, right? Like for someone sitting in South Africa or Nigeria to spend $30 a month when they don't even know if they're going to do well with e-commerce is quite a big ask, So I think you see some of that, like people thinking about building homegrown tools that work with payment providers to make it easier.
So let's look at the year 2023 and maybe a little bit of 2022, right? The year 2023 and a little bit of 2022. What trends did you notice that shaped, the payment and e-commerce space in Africa?
Yeah, I can think of a few. I think the first one, and I you'll have to forgive me. I obviously have a bit of a finger on the pulse in Nigeria, but I spend a lot of my time in South Africa. So some of this is skewed a bit towards South Africa, but I think the first one would be interest in omnichannel. So omnichannel meaning I've got multiple places where I'm selling. It usually refers to having a physical store, a retail store, and selling online, but it also can refer to like online, social media, and retail. And I think this idea of like creating an experience in all of those used to be something reserved mainly for the very, very big brands, the H&Ms, those kind of like the big Edgar's or whatever, big brands, But I think increasingly, even smaller mom and pop brick and mortar stores are trying to create more of that experience where you can buy something online and pick it up in the store. You can buy something online, you can return it in the store. You can buy something in a store and opt in to be, approached with things online based on your purchase history. So it's a lot about data and customer convenience, but this is becoming a really, really big thing in South Africa with a lot of the larger and mid-sized retailers. And a lot of them are using Shopify point of sale, surprisingly. So a lot of migrations to Shopify happening in Africa. I haven't seen it as much in Nigeria, but it's happening a lot in South Africa. I think another one that's quite prevalent is the emergence of marketplaces. So, I think everyone in Nigeria knows Jumia. In South Africa, we have one called Take A Lot. Amazon's supposed to launch in South Africa sometime soon. I think everyone knows those really well, but there's a lot of niche marketplaces popping up that help with discoverability. So if you think about, like, I'm in Cape Town and I want to buy a sofa, and traditionally you would go to lots of sofa stores or you'd search on lots of sofa websites. There's actually like people bringing that together in one place. So I think that's very interesting, and it kind of lends itself well to like people that have online stores being able to try to find other places to sell their things. So instead of just wholesaling, you could think about like, what marketplaces can I be selling on that will help me get more sales and help me find more customers? So I think that's pretty interesting. I guess a couple more I'd call out. One is direct to consumer, like seeing a lot more brands care about selling directly. So historically in Africa, especially, brands that have this is just a random example, GoPro or Nike or something, would traditionally sell through reseller networks, right? Through other retailers, through whoever. There's a lot of brands thinking about how they can do that while it's having their own online presence and represent, and like people can buy it directly through there, and also creating better B2B experiences for their resellers digitally. There's more I can go on, like, but I think, those are like three that I think are maybe the most interesting. But Anthony, happy to keep talking if you want me to.
Yeah. So the third one you mentioned is, it's something that's interesting that I also think is, why do you think that they're going or deciding to go that route?
I think it's mainly, well, I guess in the Western countries, it's already happened for a long time. That's one thing. So I think for some of them, it's just purely like profitability, like they can actually make more money. But I think it's not, when I say profitability, it's not just a one-time thing. It's the idea for some products that if I'm buying it once from there, they have that data from me and can sell it to me again next year or the year after. So I guess it's about the value chain. If you're selling something and you're having it resold as a company, and then maybe even there's layers between that, by the time you might have a very thin margin from that. So it's tricky though, because I think a lot of the brands would get some pushback from their resellers, but if they're positioned the right way, I think they can have it both ways, where they sell products to the resellers, but they're also selling direct to consumer. So yeah, I think it's mainly about profitability, but there's other considerations as well.
Okay, that's interesting, because a few years before, they would, just decide to sit comfortably and conveniently, and oh, you guys can, we can just push it to you. You can resell, we're fine where we are right now. And profit being like the major, drive towards ensuring they do that, the direct sales. Okay, now for me, with this, I think there might just be some things that the ecosystem is getting right here on the continent, not just in terms of the exposure that it's getting and maybe the level of trust from investors, but maybe a couple of other things that we do not get to see from just looking at things from an overview. As someone who is in the space, are there some things you think that have made it much more easier for e-commerce companies to operate on the continent? Look at 5 years back, 3 years back, 10 years ago. What are those things that, as a player, is a lot more easier for you to run an e-commerce business? And what do you think is driving that change, or the positive change?
It's a good question. I think, I'm always do I answer this for Africa or South Africa? But I think it's kind of true for both. I think that it's gotten, the ecosystem has kind of rallied around e-commerce. So if I think back to when I first got started, there wasn't that many payment options. Some of them weren't that affordable or accessible for small businesses. There weren't apps that helped localize platforms. There wasn't logistics players that made it easy to print labels and do these kinds of things. So I think some of it, just broadly speaking, is as e-commerce has gotten more popular, there's people that have rallied around platforms to make them work better in markets that we're in. So for example, in Nigeria, with WordPress, with WooCommerce, there's actually like a plugin that helps localize WooCommerce to work from a tax perspective, from a Naira, like it does stuff to localize that platform, and it was built by a Nigerian developer, right? And so I think the same is true for Shopify. If I think of South Africa, you now have pickup lockers for shipping, so people can put stuff in there. You have like 6 different logistics options. There's a new provider called Tunnel that, if you're selling internationally, has made it really affordable to send things to the US, actually anywhere internationally, right? But traditionally places that were very expensive to ship to, the US and Europe. And so small businesses can actually affordably start selling overseas, which is really cool. So I think that's a big one, is just like the ecosystem improving the products. And I think that's particularly true with WordPress because it's an open source platform. That's a bit of a technical term, but it just means that you can take it and make it what you want it to be. And so developers love that. And that's why WordPress is the most popular in Africa. It's by far and away the most popular in Nigeria, WordPress and WooCommerce. So yeah, I think that's the main thing. I guess once you have a product that works and a growing number of businesses interested in it, I think it's just had a knock-on effect where people see the opportunity and go for it. I also think, I don't love this second one, but dropshipping has its issues, but what it's done for e-commerce is that people can think about, so dropshipping is when you don't have your own products, right? You sell online, but you're selling products shipping from somewhere else. So you don't have to buy stock. And I think what that's done for the positive for anyone, anywhere, is that they can start a store in the US if they want to, right? Actually. And I think it's lowered that barrier entry where you don't have to have a lot of money to do it. You just have to figure out how to get an audience or sell the right products. So, and I think where it has a downside is I just think the experience for the people buying stuff online isn't always great, but I think it's been good for people to realize the potential, even if sometimes it's laced with false promises, like you're going to get rich and have a boat, you're going to have a private jet soon, So anyways, I think you get what I'm saying. But yeah, I think it's also a big one. There's a lot of people just start online stores. They think they're going to get rich, and at least they're tinkering and trying something,
Okay. So what challenges, using you and the work you're doing in South Africa for Paystack as an example, what are the major challenges that the ecosystem needs to work on?
I think there's still some big challenges around cash. I guess it's inclusion, or just, a lot of the e-commerce opportunities in South Africa. And I'm thinking more about online stores than digital payment transactions. But there's still a lot of people that have cards that are issued that don't work with e-commerce. There's still logistic issues in South Africa when you get outside of the major urban areas. I think it's the same in Nigeria, from what I understand. So I think there's some of that access to products. I think increasingly everyone, we live in a smaller world now, right? I can find stuff that I want. Everyone wants to have different things, but it's not that easy for a lot of South Africans to get those things, especially if they can't pay for them easily, or they're not sure if they're going to get those products safely. So I think things have gotten better there. But, there's some exciting projects in South Africa to improve open banking and make it easier and safer to pay from your bank account, which doesn't really exist in a very safe, very well adopted way. And that product's called Paystack. That's a South African thing that's being rolled out. So yeah, I think there's also just a big gap in just education. We all have access to YouTube and all these things, but I think a lot of people still need to kind of get more hands-on, So at Paystack, we've started doing more workshops in South Africa and just trying to be more helpful, like getting people started, creating these like little mastermind groups where people can share and connect people. I think there needs to be more of that, because it is, even though if you're used to these things, it sounds easy, it's not that easy for a lot of people. And I think that's still a big barrier, like in some ways with payments and Paystack, we think about the opportunity being to go win big businesses and power payments for them. And that's true. But I think for Nigeria and South Africa, for every one of those, there's like 1,000 businesses that just are still learning how to do this, and whether this makes sense for them. So yeah, I mean, it's a big challenge, and we're working on it.
So on the issue of training, what kind of value do you think, these small business owners who are not exactly skilled or, do not have, the necessary knowledge, what kind of value do you think, getting them upskilled or getting them up to date, with the right knowledge, what value will it bring to the ecosystem?
Well, I think the value to them could be massive, right? Because I think it could mean someone whose world is trading in their town being exposed to like a whole new market, right? And you take someone with that entrepreneurial passion and hardworking fire, and they can learn something and then tap into something completely new, So I think I think that's very exciting, like kind of segueing into like the startup space. I think that's what makes, I'm originally from the States. That's what makes working in these markets in Africa very interesting. People trying to solve issues, So I think about like, there's some students I've met recently that are trying to solve like bringing healthy food via a digital experience into the informal settlements in South Africa, right? Like those kind of problems are really interesting that people are trying to solve, and that comes from them learning how to be entrepreneurial, in university where they're at, and then taking that to like do something from a business and social perspective that's very powerful. So, yeah, I think it's massive. From our point of view, I guess it's just we're not, at Paystack in South Africa, we're about 40 people, so we're trying to do as much as we can, but we're also just trying to also tap into communities of people that are like-minded to support them too, and just like see if we can't together, solve some of these things. So, yeah.
Okay, quite interesting. What are the biggest lessons that you've learned since you took up setting shop in South Africa for Paystack?
That's a good question. I do think initially we were just a few people, and we were being supported by the broader team at Paystack outside of South Africa. And I think we realized, and maybe this is true of every country, but we really needed to bring localize everything, like our support phone number. We need to be serious in South Africa. South Africans wanted to know that they're dealing with people, maybe not necessarily in their city, but that understand their context. I think that is probably true of many markets, but it just seemed very, very important here. I do think it's interesting, we heard from a lot of merchants that they had never met their payment provider before us, so because we spend a lot of time in person going to businesses. And so I guess in some ways it hasn't been massively difficult to impress some businesses, but it's just by being in person and being helpful and being friendly. But that seems to matter. I do think in South Africa, burned our fingers with some support issues early on and realized South Africans are not, I don't think they're that used to having great support experiences, but it's the main way that we could differentiate ourselves in South Africa by trying to have really good response times, get people live really quickly. And so I think that's been a really, really big one. What else can I share? I guess, some of our competitors that have been here for 10 years have so many payment methods, like a dozen payment methods. And when we launched, we had just the three main ones. We've since added a few more, but we kind of realized that we don't necessarily need to copy them and have all of those. Merchants are mainly happy with card and some of the wallet options and we've launched Apple Pay. Like, we really want to think about different ways that we can solve like problems. Because if we're just chasing payment methods, we could spend all of our time just trying to be copycats, So I think we're just trying to really focus on things that are impactful. People in e-commerce mainly care about the big brands, the conversion rate, the success rate, So our focus has been a bit more on making sure that when someone tries to pay, that it's successful and that it has the least amount of friction as possible. Like if someone has to go through like 10 steps, you might lose them. So we're rather thinking about things like that. I guess those are a few anyways. It's been a great experience and I think fun. It's very fun. We talked about the banter from last night. It's very fun to be part of a Pan-African company and being able to be exposed to, like we've launched in Kenya now. We're working on other markets. It's really cool to just understand the nuances in each of those markets.
Did anything really drive that decision to try to approach the customers, like being in person with the customers? Was anything driving that particular move?
Before we launched, we spent about 6 months while we were getting things set up with our financial partners, meeting with, I guess, all the stakeholders in payments, right? So it's like developers, online stores, startups, other logistics companies, like anyone sort of adjacent to payments. And I think I just realized it's a bit of an advantage when you're starting to be the new kid on the block. I mean, and even sometimes play a little bit dumb. Like before you started, I mean, once you're trying to offer a service, you can't be too dumb because no one's going to use your service.
True.
But,
Yeah.
I think out of that experience of going slow and making relationships, we had a lot of people that wanted to support us and were almost on our team when we launched or when we went into public beta, that kind of wanted to advocate for us, wanted to see us win. So I guess it's just out of that experience that we just felt like this is the better way to sell. Because, when you're getting started in a new market, I think you're kind of on your back foot a little bit sometimes. People haven't heard of you. They maybe don't trust you. And we're talking about payments here. This is people's credit card information, It's a big deal. It's a big deal. So I think any advantage we had to win the trust of people, we needed to jump on that. And I think we're in a different place now, but I still also just enjoy the interaction of people and solving problems in person. And I think a lot of people also appreciate that. So yeah, I think that's where it came from. And yeah, I think it's probably good advice for any businesses entering new markets to consider that approach.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for that one. Consider it. In case you're thinking of, expanding into, new markets, that's really good advice. Now, let's talk about payment tech, the payment technology itself. In terms of the opportunities that it has created and keeps creating for African companies, what amount of value based on maybe feedback, and interaction do you think has been created by platforms like yours?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think it's massive, right? Especially in some of the markets where Paystack operates. I mean, starting with Nigeria, there wasn't someone doing what we were doing, so if you were a developer, that didn't have funding and needed to get started with payments and wanted to build things a certain way, I think Paystack has been kind of a catalyst for that in Nigeria. And I think, a lot of my colleagues, especially ones that have been there since the beginning, take great pride in seeing the success of like so many startups around them, and feeling like, even before the Stripe acquisition, feeling like they're part of that in some way, so it's a great place to be in when your business is literally being trusted with helping them collect money and be a business. And, it's a great business to be part of making a small piece of the growth of, it's kind of like the tide's rising, like they always say. Being part of payments is like that. Like, we want our merchants to be successful, and we're also successful when that happens. And I think going forward, there's still so many big challenges that we're faced with every day. Like, being part of Stripe, we talk to a lot of multinational companies that want to enter Africa, and it's still not very easy for them. And even in South Africa, if we talk to merchants that want to enter Nigeria, which many of them do, right? Especially startups, they're like, we need to prove we can go beyond South Africa, right? And while it's easy with Paystack from an integration perspective, right? Very easy, one integration, all the markets we're in. It's not that easy from a compliance perspective. And so compliance and moving money and all these things, exchange rates, so many things, that we can talk about them if you want. But it's like, yeah, I think we're still scratching the surface of what's possible for Africa. And there's still so many challenges we're trying to solve, for people trying to do business across the continent, to do business abroad. And it's always the most fun for me when we can do something that other people can't do, and it unlocks, like, they're like, oh, that's so cool that I can do this thing, right? And so we love those kind of problems. But yeah, I don't know. I'm happy to answer more questions on that, but I think it's a very exciting space to be in, but it's also really, really challenging.
So there was a time in the history of Nigeria's financial, like a time in the fintech space, that the moment you hear regulation or regulators, everyone runs, like everyone just takes cover. What has the relationship been like, since you started managing things at Paystack in South Africa, and what advice would you give if a regulator was listening to this particular episode, coming from someone who's a player and a stakeholder? Like, I'm not like, so just something they say in Nigeria, where you can talk to someone, but like talk through someone, So to take this as like talking through, us to, the regulators.
Yeah. So I'm not that clued up and involved in any of the regulator type queries or things in Nigeria. I mean, obviously, like, we're quite a transparent company, so sometimes you'll see a photo or something of, like, our team meeting with the regulators in a certain country or whatever, and you always wear a suit, Yeah, it's always very formal. I mean, most of the comments are like, "Oh wow, I've never seen that person in a suit in a long time," right? Yeah. But in South Africa, I can say, and maybe this comes back to your question about like differences in markets or things that I've learned. South Africa, the frameworks and the way regulators work with banks is maybe a bit more prescriptive. Like, maybe there's not as much gray areas or things. I've mainly been involved in South Africa, but it just seemed like just the things that are being prescribed to us to operate here are really, really clear. And in some ways, it seems like they're much clearer than other markets that we're in. Like, I'm speaking more to new markets that we're pursuing than West Africa. But like, we've done things in South Africa for the first time in some ways, like just different things, like when a merchant reaches a certain size, they need to sign up with a bank, right? Or things like that. Like, it's there's a lot of nuance to how it's done in South Africa. And I'm not sure if that's because, say, like, digital payments has been adopted for longer here, or what the reason is. I guess if I was to say anything to regulators in South Africa, I mean, I don't have a whole lot of critiques. I think there's some ambiguity around how crypto, like, South Africa generally has been open to crypto, and from a like a PR standpoint, there'll be press releases like crypto is, being accepted or whatever, but like, it doesn't always percolate down to the level where we actually know what we can do with that. So I guess some of that's on the banks, actually, maybe more than the regulators. But yeah, it just puts us in a spot where you get mixed messages sometimes, and that's hard. It's hard we want to be able to set very clear expectations for merchants. If they want to come work with us, we want to be able to say, this is how it works. And what ends up happening sometimes in certain industries is that you end up having to take each opportunity and go chat with a million different players to see if it's possible or not. And that's hard. It's hard work.
Okay, that's interesting. So if there's like some more clarity on, crypto and other related assets, it would be, you would embrace it with like, both arms, and you'd run with it.
Yeah, and also them going and like getting everyone in the financial sector to also agree to what what the standard is. But all the banks have their own, appetites for how they want to do things. So that's maybe a tall ask for them. Yeah.
Well, where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah.
2024, yeah? What are your expectations? This can be, personal. It can be as, the country lead for Paystack, and it can be expectations for the space and the ecosystem. You can, cascade that, all the way down as you wish.
Yeah. I know 2023, I think for South Africa was quite a hard year. As Paystack, we did well, but and I think you can look at days like Black Friday to see kind of merchants that we've had multiple years now to kind of see like how big was the spike on that day. And it gives you a little bit of an indication of how people are spending and how much growth they see on those days. So I really hope, this is more of a hope than expectation, but I really hope that we see an increase in funding for startups and more of an interest in Africa. And I hope that, while we still see a lot of positive things in South Africa on the e-com side, in terms of like number of stores is up, last year it was up from the year before. It's actually at the same levels as during COVID. Like, so there's lots of people creating online stores and a lot of activity happening. I just hope that the economy in South Africa, can do well. There's a lot of like challenges. All of us have them. I know there's a lot in Nigeria too. But I just hoping that some of those things can improve for South Africa. Personally, I think at Paystack, we're in a really good place. It's kind of an inflection point for South Africa where we've grown really well. We've done very well. We have thousands of merchants. We've got some really great logos in our books, merchants are really proud of. I think we're poised to do really well this year. People are starting to know us more, and it just feels like things are in a great place for us to have a standout year. And I think that's what I'm expecting and hopeful for this year is just for us to win some of those exciting merchants, be even more present on the ground, build out our team more, and really help South Africans grow, So I sometimes feel like Paystack South Africa is like the best kept secret. When we get it in front of people, you can see like, oh my gosh, this is so much better than what we have. But it's always like a frustration that keeps me up at night. Like, why don't more people like switch to us? How do we get this out there? So I think this is the year where we make a bigger splash. So I'm very excited about that. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it, Anthony. You can see I don't have a problem speaking, so I can blabber on more if you want, but those are some of my expectations.
Okay, so let's round up this conversation with an advice on how businesses can leverage e-commerce to better position themselves to be much more competitive, in the year.
Yeah, cool. I can give some tips on that. I guess the first one, and this goes a little bit back to my comments on drop shipping, but I think you really have to have a good product and know your audience well, and like really just, it starts with having a good product. If you don't have a good product, what are you doing? So I think knowing your audience well, when you know that, like when you know who your customer is and your people, you can start to cater everything to that, the marketing, everything. I think having a really great digital experience is key. So if you have the budget to hire professionals, I think there's a lot of these, really at any budget level, you can find people to help you. But the nice thing is they work with other brands, and so they can help you create a digital experience. But if you're doing yourself, that's fine too. But, I would suggest people join online communities and ask for feedback and things like that. Because if your site doesn't function well and you're not creating a good experience across social media and on your site or app, like, you're wasting your time. You need to get that right. Definitely, like, social proofing your business. So just making sure you have good reviews, you have customer testimonials on your website in different places. I think that's really key, especially if you're a small business that is kind of newish and you're not sure if people are going to trust you. Social proofing is really key. And there's apps like Yapo and a bunch of them that will help you get reviews from your customers. So I would totally suggest that. Obviously, with payments, you need to choose a payment provider that creates a really good experience. And obviously, I'm very biased because I work at Paystack, but we've put a lot of thought into the way that our checkout works with online stores. So honestly, we've got it. We've really got that nailed down. And I think lastly, I would say you need to focus on building your audience and converting them to customers, and then thinking about how you keep them as customers. So tools like Google Analytics, using a mail marketing tool like MailChimp, there's free options for that. Or even Shopify or WooCommerce and Wix have their own email marketing tools you can use. But you got to think about that and make sure you're on top of things like abandoned cart. You can play around with ads and retargeting, but these are all big things for managing conversion. So yeah, those are some of my tips. I think there's so much out there to be helpful to. Honestly, yeah, I think you can search how do I do e-commerce and find the most popular videos and watch them. There's good stuff there. So people know more than I do.
Okay, that should work. That works. That works. That's already a lot. That works.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to catch up on all the live shows right here on africatechradio.com.